There are many awesome looking Nintendo handhelds that have been released over the years. Atomic Purple Game Boy Color, Hylian Shield New 2DS, SpongeBob Game Boy Advance SP. Even besides special editions, they've at least released many different color options to choose from. Pink, red, green, whatever. But Nintendo didn't want to put out all those options for the Switch. At least not the regular Switch, or the OLED model. You can buy a Switch Lite in blue, but if you tried that with the OLED, then fuck you, here's Splatoon. Don't get me wrong, the special edition Switch consoles look pretty cool, but it's really just special JoyCons and a cool dock maybe. The console itself never really has anything super special going on. Well, sometimes it does, but I feel like most of the time it doesn't stand out much. So, I intend to fix that, as well as a few other problems the Switch has. My sister recently picked up the new Zelda OLED Switch, and it really does look nice. Though, she's no longer had any use for her old launch day Switch. So I bought it off her and decided to give it a better makeover than what she tried to do with it. Honestly, this thing was in rougher shape than I thought it was. The backplate was cracked in the corner and the fan exhaust at the top also had a crack. I didn't even test the Joy-Cons, but I think it's safe to assume at least one of them had drift. Obviously, I'm going to replace the shell of the Joy-Cons and the Switch, but I'm not stopping there. I'll be adding an LED kit to the Joy-Cons so that they can light up, changing the joysticks to the Hall Effect ones from Ghoulie kit so they don't drift, and changing out the plastic buckle lock on the Joy-Con with a metal one so that the Joy-Cons don't slip off the rails. I've even decided to take apart the dock and put the components into a more compact shell. Most of this stuff is from ExtremeRate, with the exception of the joysticks from Ghoulie kit and the metal buckle locks I got from, I don't actually remember, but they're not hard to find. I also use a lot of tools from iFixit, and I'll talk about the importance of tools later, but for now, just understand that this video has not been sponsored by anyone. I've paid for all this stuff myself, and so I'll be giving my own opinions. Performing these modifications is definitely not for everyone. It's a very time-consuming activity that requires you to be attentive. This isn't going to be a proper how-to instructional guide either, or this video would be probably over an hour. I'll give you some tips, some advice, and I'll leave links to the guides and videos I used to perform this shell swap in the description. I'm going to talk about my own experiences and give my thoughts on the products themselves. While performing any of these modifications yourself, you need to go slow, and you need to double check your work, otherwise you risk stripping screws, damaging components, and having a real bad time. And at the same time, you don't need to have professional experience to do this, just common sense, patience, and the proper tools. Let's start by talking about the Joy-Cons. Changing the plastic buckle locks to metal ones and installing the Hall Effect joysticks are must-have mods in my opinion. I know I said this video wasn't really sponsored by anyone, but I have to give full credit to iFixit and their wonderful written guides, which I'll link to in the description, as they were a tremendous help. If you're going to open up your Joy-Con, then I would do every modification you want to do at once, rather than just doing them as you get the parts. The less you have to open and close up the Joy-Con, the better. When you put metal screws into plastic, the screws make their own threads into that plastic, and the more you have to remove and put back those screws, they eventually have nothing to grip to. I talked about this in a video I made on the Steam Deck a long time ago, but when putting the screws back in, you can turn them counterclockwise first until you hear something that sounds like a click, and this sound indicates that the screw is back in the original thread, so you can just turn clockwise to tighten. This technique is a little harder to do with some of the small screws on a Joy-Con, so just limit the amount of times you have to open the Joy-Cons by doing all the mods you want to do at once. But obviously this won't matter as much if you're putting the Joy-Cons into an entirely new shell anyways. It's still something to keep in mind though. ExtremeRate has their own video guides for installing the LED kit or swapping the shell, which I will leave links to. The most difficult part is making sure you fold the ribbon cables the right way, but it just kinda wraps around the motherboard. No soldering involved, thankfully, though it really helps to have a pair of angled ESD tweezers, which you can find for a reasonable price online. The ExtremeRate kits come with some tools, but I can't remember if they came with these. It might seem inconvenient, but you will thank me later. Now, I'm not sure if it was the new shell, the new buttons, or the LEDs themselves, but some of my buttons felt a little tight and stiff afterwards, namely the plus, minus, and home buttons. The LEDs can be turned on by holding down the SL and SR buttons for about 5 seconds. Then you hold them down for about a second each time to change to the next color. Turn them off by holding the buttons down for another 5 seconds. The LED kit that I originally received was actually kind of broken. This little latch thingy, which clamps down on the ribbon cable to secure it, arrived detached from the connector, and I couldn't find a way to put it back on. So I just sent ExtremeRate an email, showed them some pictures of what was wrong, and they had a replacement shipped out to me within a week, which was quite fast, honestly. The installation went fine for me, but when I went to sleep and woke up the next day, the right Joy-Con was no longer lighting up. It turns out the ribbon cable that connects the SL, SR, and the 4 green LEDs to the main board got busted somehow when I put pressure on the Joy-Con, so I ended up having to buy some replacement ones, and ExtremeRate actually has some that have different color LEDs, so I ended up buying those. Now the LEDs are blue instead of green, which I think is rather fitting. The Ghoulie Kit Hall Effect sticks need to be calibrated in the software before they're ready to go, but they should no longer experience drift. The buckle locks are sturdy, and now the Joy-Cons are less likely to pop off the rails. Overall, Joy-Cons look nice and sleek, and they function better than ever, except for maybe the minus button, which was always a pain to use, but now it's even more stiff and harder to push. Other than that, I'm very happy with how this turned out. Moving on to the dock, I would say that there isn't much to talk about, but a friend of mine who attempted this mod himself destroyed his dock because he wasn't following any guides and didn't know how to disconnect a ribbon cable, so he just kinda yanked it. He says he didn't pull very hard at all, and it still destroyed the connector, so I'd advise some caution. Taking apart the dock and putting it into the new shell is a really simple endeavor since there aren't too many small components to deal with. There are some tricky springs that might fly around if you aren't careful, but this should be easier than taking apart the Joy-Cons. A few years ago, there was great worry that third-party docks could fry your Switch, so if that's something that you are still concerned about, but would also like a more portable dock solution, then a shell swap is the perfect answer to the problem, since it will still use official hardware, just in a different form factor. The shell from ExtremeRate will work for both the original dock as well as the OLED, and though there are other options on the market, like the one from Bastop, I actually couldn't find that one in stock anymore. In fact, most dock replacement shells seem to be out of stock except for the one from ExtremeRate, so it was kinda my only option. That being said, I am really happy with it. They also have a model available that has some more LEDs built into it, but you have to control the LEDs with the remote, and I really did not like the idea of having another remote to keep track of. Plus it was maybe twice the price, so it didn't seem that worth it to me. Now for the easiest and the hardest part. The easiest being swapping out the backplate on the Switch, the hardest is actually replacing the front plate. This will be slightly different depending on which model of Nintendo Switch you have. I'm working on the original model, but there are replacement shells for the Lite and OLED Switches as well. So here's the deal. ExtremeRate gives you a set of tools to open up the Joy-Cons and the Switch and the dock, and it all works okay. These tools are fine for opening up the Joy-Cons and the dock, but they may cause some headaches. I absolutely would not use these provided tools to take apart the Switch. There's some very tiny, tight, and torqued screws on the Switch that are very easy to strip if you're using a cheap screwdriver bit. ExtremeRate provides some replacement screws, but if you do things properly and use the right tools, you should not have to use any of them. Plus, removing a stripped screw is incredibly annoying. Sometimes you can use the rubber band trick, other times you have to use a drill. Either way, removing the backplate is a really simple and straightforward process that shouldn't cause anyone too much trouble. And if that's all you want to do, then go for it, as it still looks very nice. Removing the front plate, however, involves taking apart the entire Switch and will take you maybe around 2 hours to do. Originally, I wasn't going to replace the front plate because it seemed like too much work, but I came around to the idea of doing it later. As a consequence of this, I kinda lost all the footage of me doing that, but I could still give you some tips. You will absolutely need to keep track of every screw and make sure that you have everything organized for reassembly. If you don't have a magnetic tray, then maybe just grab a sheet of paper, draw some boxes, label them. You could even use some double-sided tape to hold the screws in place. I'd recommend some angled and blunt ESD tweezers, a spudger, some plastic opening picks, probably some thermal paste unless you reuse the old stuff, a suction cup, and something to heat up the adhesive. I borrowed this gel pad thing from a friend that iFixit sells, but I kinda didn't like it and just used a hairdryer anyways. The screws on the Joy-Con rail are very susceptible to stripping if you don't use the proper driver bit, so take note of those and apply firm downward force when removing. The scariest bit is heating up the adhesive and removing the screen. ExtremeRate has a video that I'll link to. Just take it slow with one edge at a time. The first edge is the hardest, and the rest get easier. To be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the way ExtremeRate does this in their video. They start with probably the worst edge, since all the ribbon cables are over there, and they mess up taking out this adhesive. When I was following the iFixit guide, I was able to remove the screen with the adhesive still attached to it, so I could just stick it into the new frame. You don't actually have to separate the digitizer from the LCD, so that makes things a lot easier than they would be otherwise. Overall, I'm glad I was able to do it, but it's such a hassle, I wouldn't recommend most people even bother replacing the front shell. I'm by no means a professional, but I spent an entire day doing research and watching videos before even attempting this. ExtremeRate didn't sell a faceplate that matched with the backplate I bought, which was disappointing, so I got one that matched my buttons instead. I don't know if they have a matching front plate to my backplate now, but at the time I bought this, they didn't. I'll tell you right now, it's a lot easier to just buy a skin to customize the Switch rather than swap out the whole shell, and a good quality skin can be removed without leaving nasty residue in case you change your mind. Overall, this was a time-consuming experience, but I love the finished product. I also bought this slim case from TomTalk, which I thought would kinda color match with the Switch. It's actually a really cool case, and I'm quite happy with it. My JoyCons won't slip off the rails, and they shouldn't get drift in the sticks. The LEDs look pretty sleek through the clear shell as well. Honestly, I'm not sure how they'd look without the clear shell, but I have a feeling I'd be disappointed. Speaking of the shell, it's made from ABS. From what I've heard, transparent ABS is more brittle than it would be if it was opaque. Time will tell how well this shell holds up. Wow, that was weird to say. I should mention that I'm happy with the dock too. I still have a regular dock to use, but this one is nice and sleek. Easy to pack away if I travel or just want to move it to a different TV. Opening up the Switch itself can be really intimidating, but it also gave me a chance to clean out the fan and replace the thermal paste. As stressful as this was, I'm glad I replaced the front plate, as it really brings it all together. If you're going to attempt any of this, having good quality tools rather than the ones they bundle in with the stuff you buy will save you from stripping some screws at least. Otherwise, you could just stick to applying a skin to your Switch and call it a day. Maybe a thin case if you prefer some extra protection. ExtremeRate also has shells and stuff for the Pro Controller, but I already spent too much money on this stuff. They should give you the option to buy things without the pack-in tools for cheaper. Maybe they do, and I missed it. But either way, thanks for watching. I appreciate you and everything you do. Ciao.